So the main reason I want to look at the Crito is to approach this question of whether there's a duty to obey the law. So the idea that there's a duty to obey the law, the claim that there's a duty to obey the law is that we would act wrongly if we disobeyed the law even when we disagreed with the law. So we might not think there's a point to a certain law, or we might think that the law is in fact dumb or even immoral itself, but if there's a duty to obey the law, we should obey the law even when we disagree with it. Now that's a bit weird, right? We are handing our judgment to a certain degree over to the state. The state tells us to do something. We might think there's no good reason for it. We might even think that it's immoral. And if there's a duty to obey the law, we should do what the state tells us. So, an illustration of this, think about it this way. There's no real difference between a person who's 20 years old, 11 months and 29 days, and a person who's 21. But the law says that the person who's 20, 11 months, and 29 days can't drink. That's illegal. On the other hand, the person who's 21 can drink. So you might ask yourself, is it immoral if the 20-year-old drinks? There are other things you might imagine here too. As I said in the intro, you can think about when the state goes to war and we don't agree with the war. We might think the war is unjust. We might think there's no purpose to it. Do we have a duty to obey the law even when we don't see a point to it, or even when we think the law is wrong? Well, in the dialogue, the Crito, Socrates gives several reasons to think he has a duty to obey the law. Now, the setup here is that Socrates has been sentenced to death. Socrates was a real figure. Plato, who wrote the dialogue, probably modeled some of this from some things Socrates actually said. We don't know that he actually had a conversation like this. He probably did not have a conversation exactly like the one he has here. But the historical Socrates was sentenced to death. Most everyone agrees that the sentence was unjust. It's a long story. I won't give you guys the whole story. But basically, Athens had been through a lot of political turmoil. They had declared amnesty to people who had been involved in these events. Well, Socrates had some friends who had been on the wrong side of recent events. His friends had amnesty, Socrates had amnesty, but people had a grudge against him. Socrates also had a habit of going around and showing that people who claim to be experts on grand things like justice or beauty or religion actually didn't know what they were talking about. So Socrates had made a lot of enemies. They brought Socrates up on trumped up charges. He was convicted. He's sentenced to die. If you guys look at the sort of image that goes with the course as a whole, it's kind of a spoiler. Socrates does in fact die. He drinks hemlock, which kills him. In this dialogue, Crito is trying to convince Socrates to bribe the guard and leave. Now, Crito was a friend of Socrates. A lot of Socrates' friends were very wealthy. They had come up with some money. They're going to bribe the guard. Socrates can escape his prison sentence. If they bribe the guard, he can go to another city and live out the rest of his days. Now, Socrates says, well, I shouldn't escape. And he has two sets of reasons for this. One set of reasons, Socrates is like, well, I'm an old man. I don't want to live anywhere else. You can just picture him being a grumpy, crotchety old fella. Well, those aren't the reasons I'm interested in. Socrates actually thinks that even if he wanted to leave, it would be morally wrong for him to leave. He shouldn't do it. Even if he were a young guy who were excited to live in another city, he thinks it would be wrong to leave Athens. Why? He thinks he has a duty to obey the laws of Athens, even if he doesn't agree with them. He doesn't think he's guilty. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong. Nonetheless, he thinks he has a duty to obey the laws of Athens, which have said You, Socrates, have done something wrong. You deserve the death penalty. Now, what Socrates supposedly did wrong, supposedly he was an atheist, and supposedly he had corrupted the young of Athens. Both of these things would get you the death sentence in Athens. Again, Socrates, probably by almost any standard, he wasn't guilty of this. At his actual trial, which there are records of, they certainly didn't prove he was, so Socrates has been unjustly sentenced to death. Nonetheless, he thinks he ought to obey the law. So the question I want to ask here is not, what do we think of Socrates being a crotchety old man who doesn't want to live somewhere else, but does Socrates give a good argument that there's a duty to obey the law, that there's a duty to do what the law says even when you think the law is wrong? So Socrates thinks there is. He thinks there's a duty to obey the law even when you disagree with it. And Socrates gives 3 different lines of argument. Now, Socrates doesn't actually call any of these by the names I have listed here, but these are the names they have in the literature. It's kind of amazing. This was written over 200,000, sorry, not 200,000, that's not that long ago. It was written over 2,000 years ago. But the lines of argument Socrates gives, though he doesn't develop them, are actually the lines of argument people will still give today about whether. So the 3 lines of argument in the modern literature when people debate these are called the associativist argument. We might say the state-like parents argument, states like a mother or father. Second, the tacit consent argument. You could basically sum this up as the love it or leave it argument, maybe more accurately the leave it or obey it argument. And finally, the natural duty of justice argument. Natural duty of justice argument asks you to imagine, well, what if no one obeyed the law? What if everyone broke the law whenever they disagreed with it? You wouldn't want to live in that world, so you shouldn't break the law whenever you disagree with it. Probably already see that 3 is a very recognizably Kantian argument. So I want to go through each of these arguments and see what Socrates' argument is, and also whether it's any good. Now, one thing you guys might have noticed is that Crito is not very bright. Crito is kind of an idiot. Socrates says stuff, and Crito's like, well, okay, you're right, Socrates. Let's not do that. Let's imagine ourselves as Crito, but a smarter Crito. As we go through each of these lines of argument, let's imagine what Crito would say to Socrates if Crito weren't a complete dope. So I think there's actually some pretty convincing things he could say to Socrates for 1 and 2, and even 3, Socrates might not be as clearly right as he thinks he is. So let's put some pressure on these arguments and ask whether A, they give Socrates a good reason to stay and face the death penalty, and B, how convincing they are to us as reasons to think that we should obey the law, that we have a duty to obey the law when we don't agree with it. So one thing to notice about Socrates' argument is he actually has several, as I've said. And he kind of muddles these up, he kind of blends them all together, but I think it's good to separate them out as I did in the previous slide. So I want to go through them in turn. And the first argument he gives for a duty to obey the law is this, what philosophers call the associativist argument. I don't exactly know why they call it this. This is just what the jargon philosophers use. You don't need to know that. Just think of this as the state as parent argument. So Socrates' idea is we have duties to our parents, so we have duties to the state because the state's like a parent. Let's go through each of the premises of the argument. So Socrates says we owe our existence and education to the state, so the state is like a parent. We have duties to our parents, so we have duties to the state. So we have a duty to obey the state's laws. Now let's look at this argument and ask ourselves if it's a good one. Remember I said one of the reasons that we distill arguments, we put them in this form of premises and conclusion, is to see if the argument actually works. So one thing we should do is to go through each of the premises, see if we buy the premises, see if they're good premises. So we owe our existence and education to the state. Do we buy that? Well, I think we should, right? Imagine what things would be like if there were no state. And if you guys have seen the Mad Max movies, it'd probably be a lot like that, right? Except not as cool. Everybody would be trying to kill everybody. Most of us wouldn't live that long. Those of us who did wouldn't have fine old lives. We would be struggling even to survive. We certainly wouldn't be in college learning about Socrates, or in my case, teaching Socrates. Without a state, most of us would die. Those of us who didn't would be way worse off than we are now. So Socrates says the state is like a parent. Premise 1, pretty good. Is the comparison that it's like a parent also pretty good? Well, I think in many respects, yeah. State protects us. It has a huge role in making us who we are. Parents do that. Seems that the state and our parents are pretty similar in some respects. We have duties to our parents. Well, do we buy that premise? I think we probably do, right? Most of us think we have some duties to our parents, right? You know, we get our parents' Mother's and Father's Day presents. You know, if you have 8 calls from your poor mom on the answering machine or the voicemail, you call your mom back, even if you have other stuff to do. We do think that we owe our parents. Well, so then Socrates says, if the state is like a parent, we have duties to the state, so we have a duty to obey the state's laws. Well, now, is this a good argument? Think about it. If there's something wrong with it, if you don't agree with this, what's wrong with it? Where does it go wrong? Well, I think there's a couple respects here. For one thing, this argument seems to have a missing premise. Remember I said, sometimes arguments will have assumed premises. This one seems to have a missing premise. Well, maybe a couple missing premises, right? So it says, we have a duty to obey the state's laws. Well, it seems to say we have a duty to obey our parents, so we have a duty to obey the state. So let's look at this argument with the missing premise filled in. We owe our existence and education to the state, so the state is like a parent. We have duties to our parents, so we have the same duties to the state we have to our parents. One of the duties we have to our parents is to obey them, so we have a duty to obey the state's laws. Well, once we fill that premise in, ask yourself, is it a good premise? Premise 5 is the one changed the others just a little bit, but premise 5 is the one I'm filling in. Do you buy premise 5? I'm going to bet that you don't. I mean, I certainly don't. I get along pretty well with my parents. They don't tell me to do stuff because they know I'm a grown person. But if they did, I wouldn't think I had to listen to them, right? If my parents told me, well, now, Sam, I know you want to live here, but you need to buy a house in this other place. You want to live in Norfolk, but no, you should live down in Chesapeake. If my dad said that, I'd be like, all right, Dad, whatever. And I think you probably think the same way, right? If your parents said, well, that woman or that man you're dating, no, you shouldn't marry him, I forbid it. You'd probably be like, okay, folks, this is not a 19th century British drama. You can't forbid it. I'm sorry, I'm going to do it anyway. Right? We don't think that adult children have a duty to obey their parents. We have a duty to do a lot of things for our parents. We have a duty to respect them, maybe. We certainly don't have a duty to obey them. So even if we accept Socrates' argument that the state is like a parent, it's just ridiculous to think that that would give us a duty to obey the state's laws. Now, you might also even push back on 2. Is the state really like a parent? Is it really like a parent in the ways that matter for this argument? Maybe not, right? Why do you think that you have a duty to your parents? If you do think that, Well, you probably think that your parents have not only benefited you, they've not only done nice things for you, helped make you the person you are, you think that they've done it because they love you and because they want the best for you. Whatever you think about our state or about Socrates' state of Athens, that's just not true, right? It's not like your dear old Uncle Sam has made many sacrifices for you. It's not like Uncle Sam is going to cry if you break the law either. So you might say to yourself, well, I owe my parents because they're living, breathing, flesh and blood humans who have made sacrifices for me because they love me. The state's not a person. The state certainly doesn't do things because it loves you. The state probably can't love you, right? So I don't think this is a very good argument. Now, if it works at all, what Socrates might establish is that there are some duties to the state. But think about it this way, that this argument, if Crito were smarter, if Crito weren't a complete dope, then he might actually turn it against Socrates, right? Imagine that your mother or your father were temporarily insane and they were going to do something terrible like kill an innocent person. Well, you certainly wouldn't think that you should obey them and do whatever they say. You'd probably think you should stop them. You'd think, not only should I stop them, they will thank me later. Well, a smart Crito would say to Socrates, it's like, well, if you really love Athens, if it's really like a parent to you, Socrates, you'd keep it from murdering an innocent person. If it was going to, you're an innocent person. Well, your duty to the state means you should keep it from doing something awful. So far from showing that there's a duty to obey the law, this argument might actually show that there's a duty to disobey the law when you think it's wrong. So a smart Crito could actually turn this argument against Socrates. Okay, so the second line of argument Socrates throws out is what philosophers call tacit consent. I call it the leave it or obey it argument. So Socrates says, well, Athens gave me a choice to leave if I didn't like its laws. I didn't leave, so I've agreed to obey its laws. A much more developed, smarter version of those love it or leave it bumper stickers that I'm sure you guys have seen. Is this a good argument? Let's go through the premises and ask ourselves if it is. We have received benefits from the state. Well, for the reasons I gave in talking about the state as parent argument, I think one is almost certainly true, right? We go to public schools, most of us. We are protected by the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And what's more, without the police keeping order, things would just be terrible, right? Mad Max world. Okay, so one I definitely agree with. But one won't get you what you need, right? You don't have a duty to listen to somebody just because you've received benefits from them, right? I like NPR. I listen to NPR on my way home a lot. I don't think NPR has a right to order me around to tell me to do stuff. So the second argument, or the second premise in Socrates' argument, is crucial. By not leaving our country, we have agreed to obey its laws in return for those benefits. It's not just that we've received benefits, we've in a sense made a deal with the state to do what it says by not leaving. So we have a duty to obey the law. Now, I actually think if premise 2 were true, this would be a good argument. If we receive benefits and agree to do something in return, then we are obligated to do what we promised in return. If my friend helps me move and makes me promise that I will help him move in the future, well, I'd be a bad person to break my promise, even if helping a person move is pretty unpleasant, right? The question is, do we actually buy two? By not leaving our country, we have agreed to obey its laws. I don't think we should. Look, this seems to say even though the state never tells us that we've agreed to obey its laws by not leaving, we somehow have. We were never told that we've agreed, but we have agreed. I mean, imagine if I told you, oh, by the way, by staying in this class into the third week, you have agreed to help me move the next time I move. I never told you that, but you've agreed to it. You know, you'd call, well, I won't use the word I'm thinking, you'd call nonsense on that, right? You'd say, no, look, I've only agreed if you actually told me. You can't just make the rules up and say, I've agreed. For me to have agreed to something, you have to give me a choice and say, by doing this, you have agreed to this other thing. Have any of us done anything like that when it comes to the state? Think about that. I mean, no. If you register to vote, it doesn't say, oh, by the way, you've agreed to obey the laws. If you're a guy, when you sign up for selective service, it doesn't say, oh, by the way, you've now agreed to obey the state's laws. When you pay your taxes, there's nothing at the bottom you sign, oh, I've agreed to obey the state's laws. None of us seem to have done anything that really counts as consent. Now, the only exception to this might be some people who've taken jobs as, say, soldiers, or maybe the president who swears to defend the Constitution, or naturalized immigrants who, as part of the immigration ceremony, make a promise. But most of us have made no such promise. So I don't think this argument works either. If we had agreed to obey the laws, we would have a duty to obey the laws, but we haven't agreed to obey the laws, so the argument doesn't work. So the final argument I want to talk about, and I think this is actually Socrates' best argument for there being a duty to obey the law, is what philosophers sometimes call the natural duty of justice argument. You'll sometimes hear this called the Kantian argument for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, for one thing, years later, Kant actually offered an argument for a duty to obey the law that was a lot like this. But more than that, if you look at the first premise, if you cannot universalize a principle, it will be immoral for you to act on that principle. That's very recognizably Kant's formula of universal law. So second premise, you cannot universalize the principle everyone will break the law when they disagree with it. So it would be wrong to break the law whenever you disagree with it, so we have a duty to obey the law. Well, so is this a good argument or not? Now, as I've said, I think this is Socrates' best argument for a duty to obey the law. Let's go through the premises, see if we think they're good ones. If you cannot universalize a principle, then it would be immoral for you to act on that principle. Well, how good you think that premise is probably depends on how much you agree with Kant. Do you buy Kant's formula of universal law? You know, but I do think this is a pretty good premise. Most of us do think it's wrong to act on a principle that you wouldn't want other people to act on. Premise 2, you cannot universalize the principle everyone will break the law when they disagree with it. Well, again, think about what would happen if everybody broke the law every single time they disagreed with it. Once again, you'd be back in Mad Max world, you'd have anarchy, you'd have chaos, you wouldn't want that. So it would be wrong to break the law whenever you disagree with it, so we have a duty to obey the law. Now, honestly, I actually think this is a pretty good argument. I actually think Socrates, with this argument, establishes that there is a duty to obey the law. Now, the problem is, I'm not sure he actually establishes that he has a duty to stay and face the death sentence. I think a smarter Crito could say, okay, I'll grant you that there's a duty to obey the law. I'll grant you that it would be wrong for everyone to break the law just whenever they disagreed with it. But what I want to disagree with you about, Socrates, is how far that duty goes. Do we always have a duty to obey the law? Is the principle here something like everyone breaks the law whenever they disagree with it? Or, and what I'm proposing to you, Socrates, something more like, if the law is going to do something horribly unjust, like execute an innocent person, it's okay to disobey the law, even though we should obey the law otherwise. If that's Crito's principle, I do think you could universalize it, and maybe it wouldn't be wrong for Socrates to leave. At any rate, what I'm interested in here is this phenomenon of when the law commands something horribly unjust. Even if we think generally we have a duty to obey the law, what do we do then? That's when conscientious objection and civil disobedience come in, which we will talk about in the coming lectures.